A patron asked that I compare the ZMF Eikon to the Denon D9200. What a patron wants, a patron gets. Maybe you're familiar with ZMF. Well, you should be. It's only among the hottest names in audiophile jargon. They hand-build each and every headphone, and each and every headphone costs at least one hand. These things are expensive. The Eikon is not their bottom or top tier. It is in the middle, costing around $1,400 to $1,500 depending on the type of wood finish you get. The 9200, by contrast, is the best that Denon makes. It is their top tier headphone that costs around $1,600, though you can easily find it for much cheaper. These are also hand-built, but are not the boutique product that ZMF creates. Let's get ready to rumble! Both headphones have stellar build quality. There's no doubt at all that ZMF spends a great amount of time making sure every headphone they ship has got all its screws, glues, and blues. I have several of their headphones and can attest to the phenomenal build. The Eikon is no different from the rest of the ZMF line in this regard. The headphones are big and bulky, but surprisingly not heavy. From a distance, you might think that the Eikon weighs as much as an Audeze LCD headphone, but once in the hand, you suddenly question where all of that extra weight disappeared to. Don't get me wrong, the Eikon is not a light headphone. It's not like the HD600 or any plastic headphone, but neither does it weigh what it looks like. Then there's the D9200. It is also a very light headphone. The 9200 is smaller and easier to handle than the Eikon, its aluminum frame showing a bit more bend than the Eikon's beefier components. Fit and finish on both headphones is stellar. It should be no surprise that both the 9200 and Eikon's wood ear cups are finished by hand. Denon has a video showing how each letter in the Denon logo is hand-painted. However, the 9200's wood has a rougher texture and looks, to be quite honest, cheaper than the wood on the Eikon. Part of the reason is that the Eikon's ear cups are polished and lacquered. This results in a shiny sheen and a smooth feel. One is not better than the other, simply different. As for comfort, well, both are fairly comfortable headphones, but in different degrees. The Eikon's larger ear pads provide a better seal around the ears. They are also more plush, thicker, and softer than the ear pads on the 9200. Both headphones use real leather. On the other hand, the 9200's headband is more comfortable than the Eikon's. It is hand-stitched leather that feels supple. The Eikon's headband has a suspension strap under the leather. It's sort of a hybrid suspension system. As for ear cup movement, both headphones have a significant amount of adjustability, but the Eikon's ear cups, as well as all ZMF headphones, can be turned 360 degrees. I think this makes little sense. On a few occasions after putting the headphones in a bag and taking them out, I have found that the ear cups have turned the wrong direction and need to be adjusted. I think it's fair to say that both headphones provide enough adjustability for a comfortable contoured fit on your head. As it should be around this price range, build and comfort are exemplary on both headphones. There are give and takes, of course, but nothing that is immediately disconcerting or irregular. ZMF does a poor job at explaining what their headphones sound like. It's usually very vague, which leaves much to the imagination. Often, I read reviews of ZMF headphones I own and scratch my head wondering where those people got the idea the headphones should sound the way that these people think. Regardless, all ZMF headphones have their own unique sound signature. ZMF does not have a house sound, and that's not their thing. Instead, Zach Mierbach tunes his headphones to his own personal tastes. You really cannot get more boutique than that. Denon, however, does have a house sound. That sound has shifted over the past decades and from line to line, but it is fairly consistent. Denon enjoys full bass emphasis and a treble push. It does not matter which headphones you buy from them, this general sound signature will be present. ZMF says that the Eikon has a, quote, linear, powerful, dynamic, and super resolving sound. They claim that the Eikon has a punchy sound that is close to neutral and fully musical. Denon says that the 9200 is designed to provide detailed, accurate sound with rich, warm tones. As you can tell, neither company says anything meaningful. It's all audiophile, nonsensical jargon that is subject to subjective interpretation. For this comparison, I plugged the 9200 and Eikon into the Earman TR amp and the Monolith Liquid Spark connected to the Shitmode 3. I volume matched to the best of my ability. I played music from Amazon Music HD. There was no problem driving these headphones. The 9200 is a very sensitive headphone with 24 ohm impedance and an SPL of 105 decibels. The Eikon, on the other hand, is 300 ohms with an SPL of 98 decibels. Clearly, one is easier to drive than the other. Most desktop amplifiers will be plenty for these headphones, but if you are considering using the Eikon with portable players or your phone, you will need an amplifier. On the Earman TR amp, the Eikon achieved very comfortable volume around 10 o'clock on the volume dial. For the 9200, I heard a similar volume at around 9 o'clock, but frankly, I would have preferred just a little bit less. Unfortunately, the TR amp has significant channel imbalance and becomes mute below 9 o'clock, which is a testament to Earman's laughable attention to quality control. On the Liquid Spark, with normal gain, I got a comfortable listening volume with the knob at just past 10 o'clock on the Eikon. On high gain, I got similar volume just below 9 o'clock for the Eikon. For the 9200, I got similar volume on low gain at just above 8 o'clock. On high gain, the knob was around 7 o'clock. Needless to say, the Liquid Spark had no channel imbalance. I suppose China wins this round against the vaunted European brand. Bass response between these headphones is noticeably different. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the 9200 recreated the sub-bass rumble but did not accentuate it. The transients was fast, particularly for a dynamic driver. Sub-bass and mid-bass tended to meld somewhat, but the bass and mids remained fairly separate. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the song, the organ cut through the other instruments, but did not overwhelm them. The rolling thunder effect did not overpower the instruments. There was excellent separation among all the instruments, and I could hear individual instruments most of the time. On the Eikon, the sub-bass rumble was slightly accentuated compared to the 9200. The decay was slower than on the 9200. The rumble effect sounded muddier on the Eikon, and sub-bass and mid-bass melded to a greater degree than they did on the 9200. When the crescendo hit, the organ was powerful, much more so than on the 9200. It drowned out the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was thunderous and overwhelmed everything. I could not hear individual instruments clearly. In Conquer by Overwork, the Eikon presented elevated sub-bass and mid-bass. The mid-bass impact was fairly hard, though seemed just a bit blunted. In other words, although the drums were impactful, it always seemed as if there was a thin sheet over the drumhead, taking some of that force out of the sound. I could hear different drums and their tonalities, but these instruments tended to meld more than not. The sound of rolling marbles at the beginning of the song was fairly accurate, though a little muffled. On the 9200, the drums were clearer and more separated. The sub-bass was less accentuated than on the Eikon, and I would say fairly neutral. Mid-bass impact was not as powerful as on the Eikon, but what the 9200 presented also did not sound blunted. I could hear individual drums and their tonalities. Unlike on the Eikon, the 9200 tended not to meld these instruments. The sound of rolling marbles at the beginning of the song was clearer on the 9200. I next listened to a number of hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, Uproar, New Patek, and Reel It In. The 9200 recreates sub-bass conservatively. In other words, the sub-bass was present but not accentuated. On some tracks, it sounded a bit rolled off, while in others, it sounded just about neutral. Mid-bass was more elevated in comparison to the sub-bass. Vocals remained 2 steps ahead of the mix and retained their sparkle, which was slightly pushed up. I often got the impression that drums and bass were behind a screen, not front and center. This may sound like a bad thing, but it really isn't. Remember, the drums are supposed to add rhythm and emphasis, not overpower the vocals, and in that regard, the 9200 excels. On the Eikon, these same songs had a rather different effect. The sub-bass was slightly more obvious and mid-bass lingered longer, and the sub-bass and mid-bass melded more so than on the 9200. Vocals were about one step ahead of the instruments. The sparkles I heard on the 9200 was mostly rolled off on the Eikon. This resulted in a smoother vocal presentation for these tracks. Recall, I said that the drums on the 9200 appeared in the background, but on the Eikon, drums seemed far more emphasized. Instead of adding rhythm in the background, on the Eikon they are very much a primary player. Overall, the bass response was noticeably different. The Eikon presents a muddier signature and the 9200 is a clearer headphone. If neutrality was the issue, then I would say that the 9200 is closer to neutral for bass. The Eikon clearly is not. The Eikon's bass is nothing like Bose or Beats, which elevate bass to insane levels. I suspect many would appreciate the Eikon's longer reverberation, more emphasized bass than the 9200's more lean response. The mid's presentation is also significantly different on these headphones. In Why Am I Like This by Orla Gartland, there is a grain and sibilance recorded into the track. Some headphones accentuate one or the other and some roll them off. Few keep these details neutral. On the Eikon, Orla's voice was very smooth, and the grain that is typically present was mostly missing. The sibilance in her voice was neutral. The guitar had accurate timbre and decay. The drums were elevated, though the vocals remained at least one step ahead. The bass, drums, and guitar melded when they played at maximum. The 9200 presented Orla's sibilance with much more emphasis than on the Eikon. Where the Eikon seemed to have the sibilance just about neutral, the 9200 elevated that same sibilance by several more decibels. The grain was clearer on the 9200 and appeared fairly neutral. The neutral grain and elevated sibilance resulted in a harsher sound on the 9200 than what I heard on the Eikon. The guitar sounded clearer on the 9200 and its transience was faster. The drums, bass, guitar all were more separate on the 9200 than on the Eikon. The vocals were 1 to 2 steps ahead of the mix. On Want You Back by Haim, the 9200 again accentuated the sibilance in the primary vocalist. It was frankly at my personal threshold. There are two backup vocalists in this song, and both could be heard with their individual tonalities. When the entire mix began to play at maximum, these backup vocalists remained clear and distinct, and I could still hear their individual voices. The guitar, piano, drums were clear and distinct. The Eikon had a smoother, more relaxed presentation of this same song. The primary vocalist sibilance was nearly entirely rolled off. Her voice was more intimate than on the 9200, seemed closer to my ears. The backup vocalists were clear and their individual tonalities fairly obvious. When the entire mix played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded and sounded as one. The guitar, piano, and drums also tended to meld. On Superposition by Young the Giant, the Eikon had elevated mid-bass. The bass guitar was easily audible when all the instruments were playing. The ukulele sounded accurate with proper timbre. The primary vocalist sibilance was rolled off and his voice was very smooth. There is a backup vocalist in this song, but he is not audible on the Eikon. Indeed, there were portions of the song where the bass simply overpowered the other instruments. The 9200 had a more neutral presentation of this song. The bass instruments were significantly less emphasized than they had been on the Eikon. The primary vocalist sibilance was obvious and a little elevated. The bass was in the background and never overpowered the other instruments. The 9200 also presented a bit of grain in the vocal frequency, whereas the Eikon had totally smoothed that out. It was easier to hear the backup vocalist on the 9200. Overall, the mids are rendered quite differently on both headphones. The 9200 might appear neutral, but that slight sibilance push is irregular compared to the rest of the headphone's tonality. Indeed, the bass response was fairly neutral, the timbre of instruments seems accurate, and the vocals appear natural except for that sibilance push. I do not think that the 9200 sibilance is harsh or fatiguing, and certainly your particular recording and amp deck will have something to say about the experience. However, compared to the Eikon, the 9200 was simply not as smooth. I have repeatedly said of the Eikon that it is a smooth headphone. It does not render neutral mids, just as it does not render neutral bass. But the Eikon's presentation is still very relaxing. Harsh recordings or recordings with harsh instruments will sound much smoother than they should. every instrument and vocalist appears well within comfortable listening parameters. Nothing ever becomes peaky or harsh. The treble response is marginally different in presentation and moderately different in tonality. There's a distinction. By presentation, I mean the technical aspects, such as whether instruments seem to have accurate timbre and decay. By tonality, I mean how harsh or smooth they sound overall. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 9200 presented fairly neutral treble. The brass and horns appeared to have natural timbre, and their tonalities cut through the mix. Nothing was harsh or peaky, just precise and clear. I could hear separate group sets, but not individual instruments. I could hear placement of group sets. A group appeared in the center of the right ear cup, one in the far left ear cup, one further back from the others. The timpani was not particularly emphasized, and it came in for emphasis every once in a while. I believe this was fairly accurate to how it would be heard at a live concert. The Eikon presented the brass and horns with about the same amount of energy as the 9200. What was markedly different, however, were the bassier instruments that had more emphasis and far longer decay. Nothing was harsh or peaky. Clarity was more obvious on the 9200, and instruments tended to meld on the Eikon. I did not hear the same type of instrument placement on the Eikon as I did on the 9200. The Eikon presented groups either in the left or right ear cups, and everything seemed shoulder to shoulder. In Flight from the City by Johan Johansson, the Eikon presented the piano as if it was about 5 feet from me. The bassier notes were emphasized, though did not distort. All the notes tended to meld slightly. I could hear the electric buzz effect around 40 seconds into the song, though its build-up was a little muffled initially. The cello was smooth as silk and tended to meld with the piano. The more I listened, the more obvious it became that the Eikon was overemphasizing the bassier piano notes, depriving me of the clarity this song should have. That reduced clarity means that some details are more muffled. For example, the sound of creaking wood on the pianist's bench is audible, though a bit recessed. The sound of the cello's weight being shifted is also audible, but just a bit muffled. On the 9200, the piano sounded about 8 feet away. The bassier notes were far less emphasized and all notes were clear. The decay of each note was faster on the 9200. I could hear the electric buzz effect more clearly and sooner on the 9200 than I did on the Eikon. The cello was smooth, but not quite as smooth as on the Eikon. The cello did not meld with the piano and remained mostly separate. Whereas the Eikon overemphasized the bassier notes, the 9200 kept things in control and the bass did not overwhelm any other element in the mix. The sound of creaking wood was clearer on the 9200. The sound of the cello's weight being shifted was also more obvious. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the 9200 presented the piano in the right ear cup, the drum kit in the left, and the bass in the background, and the saxophone was dead center. Its tonality and timbre was accurate. There was no harshness or peakiness with the saxophone or any of the other instruments. All the instruments remained distinct and did not meld. The hi-hats and cymbals all had different sounds, which I could easily hear on the 9200. Of particular note was the way that the bass was shown. It was always in the background, and when the other instruments played lightly, it didn't suddenly jump out ahead of the mix. Instead, it was consistently in the background. On the Eikon, the drum kit was in the left ear cup, the piano in the right, the bass more forward, and the saxophone closer still. Everything seemed a few steps more intimate than they did on the 9200. The saxophone was smooth and had a very similar tonality to what I heard on the 9200. Unlike on the 9200, however, the cymbals and hi-hats sounded practically the same on the Eikon. The bass had more emphasis on the Eikon, and when all the instruments played softly, it became the center of the musical show. Instruments overall tended to meld. The treble presentation is not too different between these headphones. What is evident is that the Eikon provides a smoother experience, sometimes marginally and sometimes by notable degrees. Moreover, neither headphone gets harsh or peaky, and I would not say that either is treble friendly. In this regard, it appears that both the Eikon and the 9200 are close to neutral for treble. Throughout this test, I have tried to explain the types of details I hear. I will not rehash what I said before, but here is a summary of my impressions. The 9200 provides more clarity, which results in more obvious details. I do not think that the 9200 actually provides more details than the Eikon, but simply that the details are much easier to perceive. When I listened back and forth, I could still hear the same kinds of details, but the Eikon required me to listen more closely for them. The Eikon doesn't hide details. Indeed, compared to the likes of the LCD1, the NDH20, Mobius, or your average Beats headphones, and yes, I just compared the LCD1 and Mobius to the same playing field as the Beats, get used to it. The Eikon does not squash details to the ground. But neither is the Eikon designed to provide all details recorded into a track. In this regard, the Eikon and 9200 share something in common. They both achieve similar levels of detail retrieval and are only different in the way those details are perceived. In other words, you will hear a creaking of wood in Flight from the City, but the 9200 will let you hear it more clearly. On the other hand, the twang of bass strings will be more obvious on the Eikon than on the 9200. It's not that one headphone shows more details where the other doesn't. Instead, it is more a matter of how audible those details are. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of wind, rustling of tall grass, children playing in the background, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. So far, the king of detail retrieval in this test is the Focal Clear, which presented 16 footsteps in the first 45 seconds. The second place award goes to the Austrian Audio Hi-X55, which presented 14 to 15 footsteps in the first 60 seconds. On the Eikon, I heard 7 footsteps. On the 9200, I heard 8 footsteps. I heard the same footsteps at approximately the same points in the song. The real difference was the clarity of those footsteps, where the 9200 made it easier to perceive those details. This was entirely consistent with what I have been hearing during this test. The 9200 is a closed-back headphone. The Eikon is mostly closed-back. One would expect that even a semi-closed-back headphone would have greater soundstage than a fully closed-back headphone. But this is not necessarily true, and in this case, that precept is not accurate. The Eikon clearly has smaller soundstage than the 9200. Indeed, the Eikon's tuning results in a more intimate experience. Instruments and vocals are noticeably closer than on the 9200. And because the bass is emphasized with longer decay than on the 9200, the continued bass reverberation melds with other elements, which then makes it appear that the stage is smaller because the sound meld and interact with each other. Throughout this test, I have said a few times that the Eikon renders an instrument or sound in a muffled way. That is not to say that the Eikon is muffled. I don't think that's the case at all. Despite the warmer, intimate experience, the Eikon soundstage is about average. The soundstage is similar to that of the LCD1 and the NDH20. I believe you would be splitting hairs to find a difference between the Eikon and the HD6XX or 660S. However, the Eikon has smaller soundstage than the Hi-Fi Man Sundara. The 9200, despite its fully closed-back design, has wider soundstage than the Eikon. The more neutral bass, better separation of instruments, and faster transients makes the soundstage appear much wider. Indeed, the 9200 soundstage is above average. It is certainly wider than the LCD1, the NDH20, the HD6XX, and the 660S, and probably on par with the Hi-Fi Man Sundara. Both Denon and ZMF claim their headphones are neutral. I would tell them to drink another cup of hot coffee and try again. Both companies make similar promises that their headphones are detailed, resolving, have ultra-low distortion, neutral, and I think objectively compared, that's not exactly accurate. The Eikon's tonality is not neutral. I know ZMF says on their website that the Eikon is close to neutral, but that statement does not save them. The bass on the Eikon is elevated. The mids are smoothed out, usually crushing grain that is recorded in the tracks, and there is a significant sibilance roll-off. Treble, I will admit, appears close to neutral. As for detail, well, we talked about that already. I get annoyed with companies that boast their products have a lot of detail because it is rare such claims are true. As for the Eikon, ZMF doesn't actually use the word detail in its description of the product, but they do say that the headphones are super resolving. Maybe we're just mincing words. Regardless, I do not think that the Eikon is more resolving than lower priced gear. Indeed, you could easily make the argument that the $250 Sivka Phoenix is just as resolving, or that the X55 has more resolving detail. Denon says their headphone will provide detail-accurate sound and has rich, warm tones. Okay, there's a slight disconnect here. I think that the 9200 is more neutral than the Eikon. The bass response is definitely less emphasized. The sub-bass might be slightly rolled off, but it's not by much. The mids are neutral, but for that sibilant spike. The treble is fairly neutral. So overall, the 9200 is closer to the accurate sound mark than the Eikon. As for detail, I think you hear the same amount of detail between these headphones. The presentation of that detail is different, in which case the 9200 provides clearer rendition of the same details. Now, to the disconnect. Denon says that the 9200 has, quote, rich, warm tones, and I don't think that's really the case. I would use that description for the Eikon, not the 9200. I have the D2000, 7000, 5200, and 7200, and I once owned the MM400. All these headphones have warm, rich tones, but the 9200 is not really in the same sound profile. I think it's strange Denon chose to describe the 9200 in this fashion. Now that we've spoken of the nitty-gritty, let's summarize. The Eikon is among the smoothest headphones I have ever heard. It makes harsh recordings sound pleasing and takes pleasing recordings and adds a sheen of silk on top. No instrument or vocalist ever becomes uncomfortable. The bass is elevated and probably quite fun for most people. The mids are relaxed. The treble has good extension without harshness. The 9200 is the leaner, more neutral headphone. Its bass is far more controlled than what we hear on the Eikon. In fact, the 9200's bass is quite different from anything else Denon has ever released, at least among the headphones I have heard from them. The 9200 provides good clarity, average instrument separation, and excellent treble reproduction. How do you begin to justify expensive gear and suggest that $1,500 price tag is value? It's one thing to look at a $500 DAP or headphone and say whether it is worth spending that amount of money. But when you look at the $1,000 and higher range, we're talking about a very different stratosphere of audiophile expenditure. At this height, competition begins to dwindle, and audiophiles care more about overall presentation and equipment matching. The average person is not going to buy a 9200 or Eikon. Maybe they will want one or both, but reality will quickly bring them back to planet Earth. So this section is actually aimed at those audiophiles who are set on buying one of these two headphones. I speak to you directly. When we jump to this price range, a lot has to be taken into consideration. In my personal view, there is a list of items in ascending importance. Here's mine in this price range. Availability of the product, time for the product to arrive, competition against similar products, packaging, accessories, built-in comfort, and sound. In my list, the availability of the product is the least important factor. That is, can I buy it immediately or need I wait a few months? And like all audiophiles anywhere, sound is the principal factor. Looking at this list, you could nitpick the issue of availability and time for the product to arrive. All ZMF headphones are made to order, which means you can easily wait 6 weeks or longer. I really do not think ZMF headphones have logical competitors. ZMF sound is so different with each headphone that there is no like-for-like comparison to be made. I suppose that is a fact drawing people towards ZMF, their uniqueness. Sound, build, and comfort for both the Eikon and the 9200 are exemplary. They are different in their own respects, and you will need to decide which suits you better. If there is one thing to nitpick, I think it would have to be the accessories. Neither Denon nor ZMF do a good job of providing accessories for their MSRP. Denon provides 2 cables of different lengths. I think the cables are fine. They are covered in cloth and are very bendy, and do not transmit harmonics. But surely, for $1,600, Denon could have included a balanced cable. Focal provides 3 cables with the clear, including a balanced cable, so we know it is possible. Moreover, for this amount of money, Denon should have provided a pair of replacement earpads. The cost to Denon would be minimal, but it would make a big difference for the customer. The lack of a storage case is also a bit annoying. The Klipsch Heritage HP3 comes with a display case, which is overboard, I will admit, but clearly attention to detail was paid. Where's the Denon equivalent? Turning to ZMF, the story gets more laughable. I have never liked ZMF cables. They are vacuum cords that look and feel just like the idiot-level thick cables that Grado solders to all of their headphones. The only saving grace is that the ZMF cable is not attached and is shorter than what Grado provides. You get one cable in the box and no replacement earpads. Yes, you can order extra cables and earpads when you visit the ZMF store, but I don't think we should have to. ZMF asks a lot for their products, and these little items, an extra, shorter, thinner cable and extra earpads, are small concessions that ZMF should make. On the other hand, ZMF does ship their headphones in a storage box. It's not a display case, but it's better than the nothing burger that Denon gives us. We can argue all day long about what should have been included and how much is enough. My position is that the higher the price tag, the more the customer should get in the box. End of story. I really do not care if a company has invested a lot of resources into research and development. That's not my problem. My problem is the MSRP, and I better be convinced my money gets worthy results. This is particularly the case when we see more and more lower-priced products do better and better every year. Indeed, why spend so much money on the 9200 or Eikon when you could be equally as happy with another pair of headphones that costs a fraction? The brand name and limited quantities argument will carry customers only so far. So here's the bottom line. Both these headphones are terrible value. They are as far away from value as you could possibly get. And I hope you really did not expect me to say anything different. As for my overall conclusion, assuming money is no real hurdle, then both the 9200 and Eikon offer something unique. If you are looking to buy, and I mean seriously looking to buy, then there is nothing objectionable about either headphone. They perform well, and their own particular sound signature and design is unique to them. Although both companies make questionable promises about their respective products, there's no outright lie. I would not have described the 9200 as warm sounding, but that's neither here nor there. The Denon D9200 and ZMF Eikon are two different headphones from two different perspectives, delivering two different experiences.